Hello, and welcome to the Ontario Science Centre's live stream event. My name is Caitlin. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a host from the Ontario Science Centre. Welcome to everyone watching. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from today. The chat is open, so you can post there to say hi. And throughout our event today, you can also post any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as best we can. I'd also like to welcome our special guest today, Cylita Guy. Welcome. Cylita, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me on this, little rainy day here in Toronto.
We're glad to have you. Some of you may even remember Cylita from when she was a host at the Ontario Science Centre. So let's see where everyone is joining us from today. So maybe you can go ahead and post below. We have some people from Toronto. Nice. A lot of people from Toronto, it looks like. Etobicoke. Amazing. We can check back on that later. Welcome, everyone. I would like to begin with acknowledging the land where I'm joining you from today. As you may have guessed, I'm at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. The Science Centre sits on the lands and territories of many nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat peoples, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. As a settler, I am grateful to be able to live and work on this land alongside Indigenous peoples who have cared for it since time immemorial. I know some of you watching today may be joining from outside of Toronto, so I encourage you to learn more about the peoples, treaties, and histories of the land where you live, work, and go to school. The sites whos.land and native-land.ca can be useful starting points. There are web-based apps that you can use to help identify Indigenous nations, territories, and communities across Canada. The relationship between Indigenous people and the land is one of reciprocity and respect. This is the only earth we have, so we should do our best to take care of it. This includes the land in our cities and our neighborhoods. I have a question for everyone tuning in today. What do you think of when you hear the word urban? You can go ahead and write your answer in the chat. When I hear the word urban, I think of apartment buildings and cars and the color gray. The color gray is the first thing that comes to my mind. So what do you think of when you hear the word urban? Go ahead and let us know. I also see here that we have some people from Oakville and Richmond Hill. Welcome.
Caitlin, if I can jump in real quick, when I think of urban, I think of skyscrapers. That's always what comes to mind first for me.
Yeah. A lot of buildings, tall buildings. Yeah. So one thing you might not think about when you hear the word urban is nature or wildlife, but we share our neighborhoods with so many amazing creatures. And our special guest, Cylita, is here to talk about some of these and share a bit about her new book called Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats, Urban Ecology, Community Science, and How We Share Our Cities, where she discusses urban ecology and how we can make a positive impact in our urban neighborhoods. I don't know a lot about all of you watching, but I love learning about animals and nature, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about urban ecology. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Cylita.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. And I've got some slides for us to look at. So if we could bring those up now, that would be fantastic. So thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. As you've heard, my name is Cylita, and I want to start off by talking about what type of scientist I am. So I'm an ecologist, okay? And if you haven't heard that word before, no worries. An ecologist is just a type of scientist who studies nature or who studies the interactions between the different species on our planet. And so, what do I mean when I say interactions? Well, I want you to imagine that you are standing on the African savanna um, at a watering hole like we see in this picture. And so, you'll see in this picture there are lots of different plants and animals. There's elephants and zebra. There's probably some fish in that water that we can't see. And so, as an ecologist, I look at this picture and I want to understand, what animals eat the other animals? What types of grass do the zebra depend on to survive? If there's too much of one animal, does it mean that another can't survive? I really want to understand how all these species interact with one another. Okay, but As ecologists, we also want to ask questions about why we find some plants and animals in some places and not others, right? I don't know about you, but like a couple of the people who are tuning in today, a couple of the groups tuning in today, I'm from Southern Ontario. I see you've got some West Coast folks here. But if we all went, down to a tropical place, there would be plants and animals that we don't have here in Southern Ontario or in Canada. And so as ecologists, we try to understand why is that? Is it because it's cold here and warmer somewhere else? Or is it because of something else? And finally, as ecologists, we really want to understand why the nature we study is so important. We know that nature does a lot of good things for us. We know that having healthy ecosystems is really important. And so we try to understand how important nature is. Now, as an ecologist, I didn't study the interactions between all types of plants and animals in the world. There are lots, but instead I focused on a very specific group of animals, and that is bats. Now, I think bats are probably one of the coolest group of animals. They're mammals like you and I. That means they're warm-blooded, they're fuzzy, they give birth to live babies. But unlike every other mammal on this planet, they can fly. There are also a lot of them. They live almost everywhere in the world except the high Arctic and the Antarctic. There are over 1,400, that's right, 1,400 different types of bats around the world. And so when I was going to grad school, when I was starting my journey of becoming a scientist, I could have gone anywhere in the world that I wanted to study bats. I could have gone to Southeast Asia or to Australia, to Europe, to Africa, but instead, I opted to study bats right here in the city of Toronto. And so, for those of you not from Toronto, this is a satellite image of the city of Toronto. Um, Off to the right of the picture, you'll see our downtown core. So there are lots of buildings. There's a big white blob. The CN Tower is over there. But off to kind of the center of the image, close to the lake, there's this really large green space, okay? That is a place called High Park. It's one of our largest fully urban parks in the city of Toronto. And I spent my summer studying bats that lived in this park. I really wanted to understand, in a city, how are they using space? Where are they going at night to eat? Where are they going during the day to sleep? And how is that different from what bats out in the country or bats out in the wilderness might be doing? And so because I opted to study bats in cities, right, I am an urban ecologist. I'm a type of scientist who studies nature and the interactions between species living in cities. Now, the questions that urban ecologists ask are the same as ecologists ask. They're just slightly different context, right? So here we have a picture of a raccoon, which some of you may have encountered in your own city, your own backyard, eating out of a dog food bowl, right? So somebody's put out food for their domestic pet or their dog or their cat, and this raccoon is taking advantage of this basically free food. And so, as an urban ecologist, we want to understand how species change their behavior in cities. How is it different from what they might normally do out in the wild or in the wilderness, I should say? But we also want to understand why some species do well in cities or what species do well and what species don't, like this pigeon. Guarantee you can find a pigeon in most cities across North America. And finally, we know that nature is really important. We know having it around makes us happier and healthier. So we also want to understand how we can design cities in the future to make them good for both wildlife and people alike. All right. And now more than ever, the science of urban ecology, figuring out how to design cities that are good for humans and wildlife is important because our cities are growing. Over 55% of people on the planet live in an urban area. And by 2050, the UN estimates that this is going to go up to 65%. Okay, so that's a lot of people living in a city. And our cities are constantly growing. And so it's really important that we design them in a way that makes space for both nature and humans alike. And that's why I wrote Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats, because I want everybody who lives in a city or outside of a city to learn about the nature that they share their neighborhoods with. And so in Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats, you'll get to meet 8 different scientists from across North America. And in each chapter, I kind of start off with a story about that scientist from the field. So for example, in the first chapter, I write about my own work, and I talk about a night where I almost fell off of a roof. We had a run-in with the police. We had a lot of fun. It was also a little scary. And from there, the chapter goes on to talk about the science and the hypotheses and why we were all studying the things that we were studying. And each chapter ends with a challenge for you, the reader, that is meant to get you outside, exploring, and learning more about your local biodiversity. And so, who else are you going to meet in this book? As I mentioned, I talk about my work with bats in Hyde Park, but you'll also get to meet scientists like Dr. Carly Zeter, who studies trees. And what I really like about Carly is she built herself a bike with a mobile weather station to ride around the city of Madison, Wisconsin to understand how much trees cool our cities down. You'll also get to meet Dr. Charlotte Kaiser. Charlotte studies redbuds and bees. But what I love about Charlotte's work is she uses community science. So she gets everyday people, maybe your mom, your uncle, your cousin, you. She gets everyday people to help her collect her data. And using all of this community collected data, she's learning so much about the bees that call Toronto home. You'll also get to meet Dr. Christopher Schell. Christopher studies coyotes in Tacoma, Washington. He also studies other urban carnivores or other meat eaters. And he really wants to understand not only where we find nature in cities today, but how racism and discrimination in cities and city plannings really shapes where we find nature and where we don't find nature in our cities. So I'm really excited about this book. It comes out at the end of November, but it is now available for pre-order if you'd like to pick up a copy. And so with that, we can pull those slides away. And Caitlin, I'm excited to see if you have any questions.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for that, Cylita. I've been lucky enough to get an advance copy and absolutely loved reading it, especially like hearing the personal stories from all the different scientists. I would love to learn more about you and your work, Cylita, and I'm sure the audience does too. So if you have any questions for Cylita, remember you can post them in the chat. So Cylita, what inspired you to study ecology?
Yeah, I have always just loved nature. I've, grown as a kid, I actually grew up in a city, but I spent a lot of time, at the Scarborough Bluffs, in the park beside my house, in our backyard, in our front yard with my parents. And so I was really lucky that they kind of encouraged my love of the natural world. And, when I kind of went off to university, I studied the things that I liked. I enjoyed learning about all of the creatures that we share our planet with. And yeah, it's kind of how I got into it.
Nice. And what do you love about bats?
Oh, I mean, what is not to love? They're so amazing. I mean, I think the fact that they can fly and they're the only mammals that have the ability to do that is really special, right? Their flight has only ever evolved, 4 times in kind of the history of ever. Bats do it, birds can do it, insects can do it, and the fourth group are pterosaurs, the now extinct group of flying reptiles. So it's pretty special that they're able to do that. Um, so I think that's my favorite thing about them. But I also love that there's just so many, right? There are over 1,400 different species of bats. They're the second most species rich group of mammals. So they're all so different from one another, and there's just still so much to learn about this group.
Do you have a favorite bat? I know there's so
Oh,
many, but is there one that just you love to learn about?
I feel like it changes every single time someone talks to me. One species that I really like, it's called the Honduran white bat, and they are super cute. They live in tropical places, and so they are a type of what we call a tent roosting bat. So they'll find a really large leaf, and then they'll chew along the seam of the leaf, and it'll fold. It'll make a little tent, and then they'll roost up inside this little tent. But the cute thing is they're all white. So their entire bodies are covered in this white fur, and then they've got these little yellow faces and these kind of like pig-like noses. And so it's like these white little cotton balls roosting underneath this big banana leaf. It's pretty cute.
Oh, that's super cute. Another question I have here is, what made you want to write a book?
Yeah, I've been really lucky. I've done science communication in a lot of different ways as a scientist. As you mentioned, I was a host at the Science Center for almost a decade. I did a lot of presenting and talking to people, and that was really great, and I really enjoyed it. So I wanted to kind of try, sharing my excitement about something that I do for a living, and something that I'm very passionate about and my friends are very passionate about. I wanted to try to share it with people in a different medium. And so this book was the way that I decided I wanted to tackle it.
I love that. So I have a few questions now from our audience.
Mhm.
Kylie Dale wants to know, are bats dangerous? I've also seen some comments about vampire bats.
Okay, so let's tackle this in kind of two pieces. I want to talk about the vampire bats first because it is, spooky season. Halloween is upon us. So vampire bats are very special. There are only three types of vampire bats. They all live in South America, and they are very special in that they feed entirely on blood. So they're what we call hematophagous. Now, don't worry, they don't really like to feed on human blood. They much prefer, to feed on livestock or wild mammals or wild birds, but they don't suck blood. Okay, what they do is, when an animal is sleeping at night, they'll fold up their rings, they'll crawl over, and they'll make just a tiny little cut on that animal. And then they'll kind of just lick the blood up like a cat licking up milk. So, not maybe as creepy as they've been made out to be. But, because vampire bats do feed on other animals, they can share diseases with them. And just like any other type of wildlife, bats can share disease with us humans. And so, that question of like, are bats dangerous? If you leave them alone and you give them lots of space, just like any other wildlife, they're not going to go out of their way to bother you, right? So always
Mhm.
make sure you're observing, watching from a safe distance. But if you encounter a bat, you get bitten by a bat, it's really important, especially here in North America, to seek medical attention because they can transmit the rabies virus, which we have treatment for, but you got to get treated right away.
Nice. I have another question from Magic the Kindred. What are the chances of seeing a bat in daylight?
In daylight. So, quite rare because they are not, most species are nocturnal, they come out at night. There are a couple species that will, periodically like come out a little early in the evening, so while the sun is kind of just setting, but you generally don't see them during the day. And if you are seeing a bat in the day, and it's kind of on the ground, it's behaving weirdly, again, it could be a sign that perhaps it's sick with rabies. You can call a wildlife control officer, they'll come and collect it. That being said, sometimes you will find bats that have found a maybe not so ideal spot to go to sleep for the day. They might be on the outside of a building, on the outside of a tent, in a space that looked great in the dark to curl up for the day or their night. But when the sun comes up, they're kind of just left hanging there.
Very cool. Yeah, I've definitely seen some before outside of my house in the daytime. Arnie Canchi wants to know, can bats see clearly?
So this is a great question. So most types of bats echolocate. So they use sound to help them get around their environments. And I think this has led a lot of people to, to use, or we've heard this old phrase, blind as a bat, because bats are using sound to get around. But bats that echolocate can still see, some not so well, but there are bats like flying foxes who have extremely clear, extremely good night vision. They can't echolocate, they've never had the ability, and so they use their eyes to help them get around in the dark.
Okay, very cool. Someone else asked, where can I go in the city to see bats? Is there something for kids at Hyde
Okay.
Park?
Is there something for kids at Hyde Park? And where can I go? So Hyde Park is a great spot to see bats in the city during our summer months. So I would try July and August, kind of when you'll see the most. Hyde Park actually has a great nature center that leads bat walks, and they've got these little handheld acoustic detectors that we can use to hear bats and hear those echolocation calls that are normally outside our range of hearing. And so Hyde Park is a great spot to go, but really anywhere where there is a large open body of water, like a river or a pond, places where you might expect there to be lots and lots of insects, that might be a good place to go and look for bats, around sunset or in kind of the early part of the night.
Okay, that's a good tip. Kylie Dale, on behalf of the grade 4 and 5 class, want to know, how big can bats grow to be?
It depends a lot on the species or the type of bat. So most bats, are about 7 grams, just about the size of my palm. They're quite small, okay? But the world's smallest bat, I'm going to start at the opposite end of the question. Smallest bat is the size of about my thumb. Okay, it's the
Wow.
bumblebee bat. They live in Southeast Asia. But the world's largest bat, I think there are a couple species that are actually tied for the largest. Is a giant golden crowned flying fox, which has a wingspan of just over 2 meters. So
Wow.
to that grade 4 or 5 class, if there's an adult in the room, ask that adult to hold out their arms, and that's kind of how about roughly, depending on how tall that adult is, how big that bat's wings are going to be.
That's huge. I did not know they could grow to be that big. Well, some of them. Bonnie wants to know, are Toronto's bats affected by white nose syndrome?
So that is another. These are fantastic questions. This is just way too much fun. So for those of you who may not know what white nose is a fungal pathogen, so a fungal disease, came from Europe and it arrived here in North America, and it affects colonies of hibernating bats. And unfortunately, we have lost a lot of our native populations because of this fungus. And so, yes, here in Toronto, our bats are and have been affected by white nose. So, before my time, before I started studying bats, I was told that you could catch little brown bats a lot in the city of Toronto. You would see them all the time. And in 2 years of doing field work, I did not catch a single little brown. Now, that's not to say that they aren't here still. They're not in small pockets, but we definitely don't have as many as we used to. And so there are lots of scientists across North America who are working very, very hard to help us save and conserve and protect our local bats from threats like white nose, but also from threats like wind farms, which also affect a lot of our bats that live here in Canada.
Nice. Kylie Dale's class has a lot of questions for you. Their next one, they are learning about food chains right now, and they want to know, do bats have predators?
Okay. So bats have very few natural predators, and this is part of why they've been so successful. They come out at a time when there's not a lot of other animals around eating insects, so they have lots to eat. There's also not a lot of things that prey on them. In some parts of the world, there are what we call bat hawks. They're types of hawks that have, specialized hunting for bats as they're coming out of their cave roosts at night. They'll just kind of fly down and pick off some bats. But here, in southeastern Ontario, they don't have a lot of natural predators. Sometimes owls will take them opportunistically, so if they have the chance, but they won't go out of their way to look for them. Same thing with kind of like domestic cats or raccoons. They may eat a bat if they encounter it and then it's not fighting back, but they're not going to go out of their way to search and hunt for them. Kind of like the predator prey relationships you're learning about in your classes.
That makes sense. Andrea wants to know, why are bats important? What do they do in our ecosystem?
They do so many things. So, the bats that we feed on insects, which have been types of bats that we have here in southern Ontario, they're really important because they act as free pest control for our crops, right? They eat a lot of insects that might otherwise eat the food that we depend on. But in the tropics, there are bats that feed on fruit and they move around seeds in the landscape, helping our forests to grow up big and healthy and strong. And we also have bats that feed on nectar. And so they pollinate a lot of really important, wild plants, but also crops that we may depend on as well.
Very cool. I didn't realize that they were pollinators as well.
Yeah, and that's like kind of one of the fun. If you have time later, go search long-tongued bat on YouTube. There's some great videos of them feeding on nectar, kind of like a hummingbird.
Okay. Miranda Guerrero from grade 7 wants to know, are there any types of bats that are extinct?
Oh, you know what? So I love doing these events because at least once an event, I get stumped by a question and I have to go away and do some research. I don't know the answer to this question. So, I'm sorry, I may have to follow up with you a little bit later. I'm going to have to go do some research. Yeah.
Zahara wants to know, my son Gabriel and I met you at the Maker Fest a few years ago, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. Oh, yes, that was more of a comment. Little
It
hello.
is. It is always nice to hear from people I got to meet as a host. So hello to you both, and I'm so excited that you remember me.
Love that. Another question I have, do bats ever bite you?
Oh, yeah. So again, they will if threatened, just like any wildlife. So when I was out studying them and we would catch them, they would absolutely try to bite us, but I would wear these really heavy leather gloves that they couldn't bite through to prevent them from actually breaking skin. And I just want to emphasize again, if you or someone you know has been bitten by a bat or you think you may have been bitten, so if you're in a room sleeping and you find a bat and you're not sure because their teeth are very small, um, go to a hospital, let a doctor know, and they'll treat you appropriately, just in case and just to be on the safe side.
Yeah. Another question here, are bats' wings waterproof?
This is an interesting question. Yes, yes, in that their wings are like your skin, right? So if you think about the skin on your hand, and if you were to dip it, into a bucket of water, or if you're swimming in the pool, that water's not going to seep into you. That skin on their wings acts as protection. But they do kind of like we do. They can lose heat through that skin. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
I think so. Another question I have. Oh, this one's about rats. Mix it up a little bit. Do rats
Oh,
ever live in your
okay.
house to seek shelter? And if they do, what do you do?
Yes, so lots of wildlife in the city will sometimes try to take up residence in your home or your garage or, a structure on your property or close, right? Because hey, it's warm, it's dry, it's out of the rainy weather. And so, if you think you've got rats kind of in your house, it's really important. We don't want to be living directly with wildlife because it can be not so good for them, not so good for us. And so there are I don't want to call them pest control people. I think that's what they're traditionally called, but they're people who specialize in kind of rat proofing or bat proofing your your homes, but in a way that is good for you and the wildlife involved. And so what they'll usually just or you can do yourself, is you can go through, look for entrances that they might be coming in and out of. You can plug those entrances using steel wool, maybe cleaning up some brick, things like that. And then one of the things that you can do is for rats, especially if you want to discourage them from kind of trying to take up space in your house or on your property, clean up. Right, make sure that there's no leftover food lying around, that your garbage bins have been washed out after you have the trash picked up, that they're tucked away. If you've got a compost pile, that can be a little challenging because they like to use that compost pile, but make sure you turn it regularly. Things like that can maybe help minimize, the likelihood of a rat taking up residence.
So a question kind of similar that I have from Miranda Guerrero's grade 7 class again. They want to know, can people have pet bats? And does their poop carry any disease? And where in the world are bats most prominent or common? So it's a lot of questions. Here's a
Okay,
really
that's
good
a
answer.
that's okay. Let's start with bats as pets. They do not make very good pets. In fact, it's kind of hard to keep captive colonies in a lot of places. So sadly, bats are wildlife. We should leave them out in the wild. We're not going to have pet bats anytime soon. Um, but can their poop carry disease? So yes, and that's one of the concerns about having, let's say, a bat colony in the attic of a home. As that poop dries out, and this can happen. It's not specific to bats. It can happen. A variety of different types of animals. As that poop dries out, if we were to touch it or step on it, there are certain types of fungus that can kind of become airborne and can make us very sick. And so if we ever enter into a bat colony, we are always in full protective gear. We have respirators on just to make sure that we don't pick anything up that we don't want to pick up. And I think the last question is maybe where in the world can I see the most bats in kind of one go?
Yes, where in the world are bats most prominent or common?
Most prominent or common? So that's a tricky. Oh, it's another very good question. I'm going to say, if you want to see the most kind of different types of species, head down to South America. In our rainforest, there's incredible numbers of different types of bats that live there. But we also have places, here in North America where there's very large colonies. Also in Southeast Asia, I'm talking millions of bats living in the same place. So big colonies like Bracken Cave out in Texas are a great place to see lots of bats all in one place.
Very nice. So one last question I have for you. You feature many diverse scientists in your book, and you talk a lot about racial
Mhm.
bias. and how it contributes to scientists' experience in the field. And one term that came up was redlining. It's something that I had never heard of before, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here who's never heard of redlining before. I was wondering if you could just explain to us what that means really quick.
Yeah, and so we talk about redlining in two of the chapters of this book. For our viewers today who maybe haven't had a chance to read it. So redlining was this practice that occurred, primarily in the United States where it gets its name, but it happened other places too. Versions of it happened here in Canada. But cities would basically draw red lines around neighborhoods where, if you were from that neighborhood, they would restrict your access or not allow you to have access to certain services. And so that could include things like you would show up at a bank and try to get a loan. You wouldn't be able to get a loan. You would, try to get help buying a home, and no one would be willing or able to help you buy a home. And this was primarily done to people who were, Black, brown, Indigenous people and communities of color. And so as a result, neighborhoods that previously were redlined often don't have access to the same types of services and goods that we see in whiter neighborhoods today that are more affluent or have more money coming into them as a result of these practices.
Yeah, I found that super interesting because it was something that I had never thought of before, but the answer was, kind of always there in front of me. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all of their amazing questions. And thank you, Cylita, for answering all of those. I wish we had more time. If your question wasn't answered in the live, we will do our best to get to any questions that are left in the chat over the next few days. I have one last question for you, Cylita. I know at the end of each chapter in your book, there is an urban ecology challenge. What are some other ways that people can get involved in their community in terms of ecology?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way for anybody to kind of get involved in urban ecology or like their local nature is to just go outside, take a walk, and look around. Look around at what's in your neighborhood, what's in your schoolyard, and start to take notice. So one of the things that I first did when I was starting to write this book is I would walk around the neighborhood where my apartment was, and I would look at all the different trees. And I had never noticed that on my street alone, there were 6 different species of trees, right? And so, just by pausing and kind of looking and watching, and I recommend in the book you bring along a tiny little notebook so you can write down some notes about what you see. I think that's the best way to kind of get involved with your own local nature, is to learn a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I love the idea of carrying around a science notebook. Well, thank you so much, Cylita, for taking the time to share your book with us today. It was wonderful to learn so much about urban ecology and community science. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in. I hope you're feeling inspired to explore your cities and neighborhoods in new ways and to take care of the creatures in them. If you want to learn more about Cylita's work, you can check out her website at www.cylitaguy.com or follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Cylita Guy. You can pre-order a copy of Cylita's book, Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats, Urban Ecology, Community Science, and How We Share Our Cities, now online at Anik Press. And if you want to support your local bookstore, you can also ask them to order it in. You can find more information on our future live stream events, recordings of past live streams, including this one, and other great science content on our website, ontariosciencecentre.ca. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our social channels, and I hope to see you again soon at another Ontario Science Centre event. Our next live stream is on Wednesday, November 10th, and it will be about amazing bugs and their adaptations. Bye for now.